Greetings. So I'm essentially recording this video to document the thought system which I've developed over the past few years, because it is simultaneously the culmination of everything that I've learned in my intellectual life thus far, and also the platform upon which the rest of my life will likely be built. So I just wanted to document it as it is here and now, so that I can refer to it in the future. With that being said, I'm just basically going to jump right into it. So the whole thing spawns out of this observation that at the heart of phenomenal existence you run into this duality, and the duality is unavoidable. It's everywhere you look. It's being and non-being, it's birth and death, it's subject-object, it's self and other, it's left and right, it's positive-negative, it's everywhere. There's sort of this duality, and the problem with duality is that it implies relativity. And if you want to understand the full implications and ramifications of having the idea of relativity at the core of a thought system, I highly recommend a video by a YouTuber that goes by Formscapes. The video is called Cutting the Einsteinian Knot, and it is an absolutely amazing video, the true mark of an individual thinker. It's completely perpendicular and diametrically opposed to anything you learn in classical physics. It's worth the watch for sure. But essentially what he does is he points out the flaws of having a system built on relativity. To boil it down, it essentially it's basically because it means that everything is meaningless. You cannot have meaning if everything is relative. And so since at the heart of phenomenal existence you find duality, and duality implies relativity, then that means everything is meaningless. And I was thinking about this, but I was thinking about the implications because in a Western sense, meaninglessness is a very bad thing. It's basically chaos and But in an Eastern sense, particularly that of Taoism, meaninglessness is like the purpose of existence, to be purposelessness itself. Like, meaningless is doorway into liberation. Like, you don't have to answer to some higher meaning. It's meaninglessness. Thus is all of life. And so I was thinking about that, and two verses from the Tao Te Ching came to mind. The first, since the beginning, since before the world was, the Tao is. And then the Tao gave birth to one, and one gave birth to two, and two gave birth to three, and three gave birth to all things, or the 10,000 things, depending on your translation. And I'm vaguely aware that this references a system of emanation, which I'm not completely fluent in, but the basic of it is basically you have wich, which is the primordial state of existence before any sort of distinction whatsoever. It's just. And then from that you have hongji, which is the polarization of that homogeny. And then you have taiji, which is the duality represented by the symbol of the yin-yang. And the thing about yin and yang is that they are actually the core of a thought system in and of itself. Because just as you have one which splits into two, each of those two split into again, so you have four, and the four becomes 8, and this is where we get the 8 trigrams of the I Ching. Continuing, you have 8 becomes 16, 16, 32, 32, the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. And I do find it interesting because while we're on the topic of 64, within the Et Chaim of Kabbalah, the tree of life is composed of 10 sephirot and 22 pathways, and 10 plus 22 is 32. And the way it works is that the light descends through the 32 channels and then ascends back up through the same 32 channels. So 32 times 2 is 64. Coincidence? I think not. I think it points to some substructure underlying the nature of reality itself, but who am I to say? So, anyway, that's interesting. But going back to the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, essentially what they are the archetypal modes of change within cyclic existence. And I use the word cyclic existence as a synonym for phenomenal existence. Phenomenal existence sort of has a technical definition in my mind. The reason I like it is because, number one, I use it as opposed to like physical reality, because physical reality really relates to anything which you can describe materially, but phenomenal existence relates to physicality, mentality, spirituality, ethereal, astral, psychological, whatever you refer to whatsoever is encompassed in the term phenomenon. And so I like that. And then also, phenomena exists in relation to the word noumena. Essentially what a thing is in and of itself and how a thing appears to a separate observer. So that already encapsulates part of the duality of the inherent nature of phenomenal existence. And then existence, the existence part, existence only exists in relation to non-existence. And so right there, that term captures the heart of what I'm kind of referring to. But cyclic existence I use because cyclic existence I derive as a synonym for the word samsara in Buddhism. And so samsara is the land of birth and death, and once again you have this polarity. And the way it arises is there's what is known as the 12-linked chain of dependent origination. And so the whole 12-link chain is contingent upon ignorance, or conditioned by ignorance. And ignorance leads to mental formation, and mental formation leads to consciousness, and consciousness leads to being, and it forms this 12-linked cycle which loops back to ignorance. And I find it interesting because ignorance is essentially here what you find at the heart of reality, and the first thing that emerges out of ignorance is mental formation. And the reason I take note of that is because if you study Advaita Vedanta, particularly that of Ramana Maharshi, you are aware of what is known as the I thought. And now, in order to explain the I thought to a Western, to anyone in the Western intellectual tradition, I have to flip the metaphor yet again to Jungian psychology, because he has the distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is the conscious reflection of the self, whereas the self is the totality of everything you are, from your ego to all of the rest of the psychical archetypes, archetypes of the psyche, the entire consciousness, the unconscious, the collective unconscious, the furthest extent to everything you are. That's essentially what the self is. It's this eternal mystery which is constantly being revealed or discovered. And so, flipping back to Advaita Vedanta, you find the same thing. The I thought is equated to the ego, and it's the thought of a separate individual, as opposed to the self, which is. And in Hinduism, this is called the jivatman. The separate individual is called the jivatman, which exists in relation to the paraAtman. Atman means self, by the way. And so in the Upanishads, we learn that Atman is Brahman. And now Brahman also has two aspects. There's NirgunaBrahman, which is Brahman with qualities, and then NirgunaBrahman, which is Brahman without qualities. The only thing we can say about NirgunaBrahman is, I am the nectar of knowledge, homogeneous existence like the sky. That alone exists. We will get into that in a bit. But so NirgunaBrahman is like the noumena of Brahman. And Brahman, by the way, is usually translated to God or the ultimate nature of reality. So that's what that is. And SagunaBrahman is like the manifold cosmos, is like Krishna in chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita. It's like the infinite forms of God's mind or something. And that is essentially, so far as I can tell, synonymous with what paraAtman is, because again, Atman is Brahman, and so the great self is the phenomenal manifestation of God, and then the jivatman is the individual, the separate individual self, and that's the I thought. And so this brings us back to Ramana Maharshi, which brings us directly to the practice of self-inquiry. And now self-inquiry is the most potent practice by far that I've ever come across. When I learned it, it absolutely changed my thought structure, my perception of reality itself. There's nothing else like it. Self-inquiry is... I learned it from my guru Muji, who learned it from his guru Papaji, who learned it from his guru Ramana Maharshi himself. And so essentially the way it works is you ask yourself, who am I? And you observe whatever answer comes. And from listening to hours upon hours upon hours of Muji, I've actually come up with a little formula or like a principle that can help you. So first, whatever changes is seen. Second, whatever is seen is not the self. Third, can that which sees be seen? If so, that which whatever is seen is not the self. And so it feedback loops and just stops the mind. It just brings you to the pinnacle of what self-inquiry is trying to point to. But I'm going to go through the process because it's important to understand this. And then also, I'm going to linger on the concept of the self a little bit, because the self is the primary datum of our own experience. And so, like, if anything else, we study it as something separate. But with our self, we study it as it is in itself. And because of this, when we understand the nature of ourself, we gain insight into the nature of all of reality. And so I'm going to go through the practice of self-inquiry. And so usually the first thing people say, the first thing people say when they ask themselves, who am I, is they give their name. But the name actually relates to the personal identity. And now the personal identity is something which changes very frequently. And like literally some people, it's like day by day they're a different person, and if not week by week, month by month, year by year. Regardless, as time passes, people change. Like you yourself are not the same person that you were 5 years ago or 10 years before that. Your personality changes, and likewise, who you are in 5 years is different than who you are now, and who you will be in 10 years is different than who you are now, because we're constantly changing and growing. And there's sometimes like we identify with some quality so heavily that we say, this is myself, this is the truth of who I am. And then a few years later, if someone brings it up, you cringe and you're like, oh God, don't talk about that. That was just a phase. And so likewise, these aspects of the personality, they're like clothes. They belong to you, and you wear them to express yourself, but they're not really who you are. And so you go a little bit deeper. Who am I? And the next answer that usually comes is, I am this body. And so the thing you need to know about the body is it is what is in Buddhism termed as a samskara. The best English translation I know for the word samskara is a formation, or a composite formation. Because all formations are made of other forms, and all forms are formations, which are made of other forms, which are formations, which are made of other forms, until you get down to the constituent particles or substance of reality itself, whether it be the 5 Platonic solids, the 5 aggregates, the quarks, which make up the atoms, which make up the chemicals, which make up your body, and whatever it is, you get down to this primordial substance, consciousness. And you see that all things are made of that. And so already you can see, like, just as there are carbon atoms in me, there are carbon atoms in the earth. Just as there are oxygen atoms in me, there is oxygen in the earth. Just as there is nitrogen in me, there is nitrogen in the earth. Just as there is whatever is in this body is also outside of this body. So you very quickly see that the body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the earth or to the universe, or it's not yours. It's part of this continual cycle. It came from your mother and your father and the entire ancestral lineage from there. It belongs to all of life. It belongs to the cycle of the cycles of the ecosystem. Also, you see, every 7 years, every cell within your body is completely exchanged with a new cell. And so you aren't really, this body itself isn't even something which is permanent. it's constantly being exchanged. It's like a pattern of information which persists for a period of time. And then also the body itself is not a singular thing. It's made out of so many bones and so many ligaments and so many muscles and so many nerves and so many whatever. And so because of all of this, number one, since it's composite, that means it's impermanent. And it also means that it doesn't have an individual self. Because that's usually what we think, that there's a doer behind my actions, that there's a thinker behind my thoughts. But if you look, there's actually just thoughts. There's actually just actions. There's no I behind the body. There's just this body. And so when you see this body as it is, as some impermanent phenomena arising within your consciousness or within your mind, you see that it was born and it will die. And inevitably, as time passes, it will change. You can see that that too is not yourself. And if that's not convincing enough, you can go into deep states of meditation wherein you lose body consciousness altogether. You're just pure awareness. And if you can't access those deep states of consciousness, don't worry, you're not alone. But you go into this every single night when you go to sleep. Your body is zonked, but you're off in la la land. You're having a great time dreaming, doing whatever, creating reality with your mind. And so from this, you might come up with the next conclusion. I am not my body, I am my mind. But what is the mind apart from thoughts? And so would you claim to be your thoughts? And usually the answer is no, I'm not my thoughts, but I'm the thinker of my thoughts. But we can take an even further step and realize that the thought, or the idea, I am the thinker of my thoughts, is itself a thought occurring in your mind. And you can see this. You can watch the thoughts in your own mind. And so you can say, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not the thinker of my thoughts, but I'm at very least the perceiver of my thoughts. And so at that point, you switch the identification from the personal identity to the body, to the mind, and now to the consciousness. In Buddhism, there's the 5 aggregates are form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. Note, mental formation was the second step within the 12-linked chain. So form is the body, feeling is feeling. Perception, that I perceive my thoughts. Mental formation, I am the thinker of my thoughts. Consciousness, I am aware of my thoughts. But the thing is, those are all 5 aggregates, meaning consciousness is yet another aggregate. And the way you can understand this is that there can be no mind consciousness without a mind. There can be no body consciousness without a body. There can be no consciousness of a thing unless that thing exists. And so consciousness, although it exists independent, also exists, it's called interdependent co-arising. It exists interdependently with the mind, interdependently with the body. And so at this point, you have subject-object consciousness, which is what I call mindfulness, when one thing is aware of another. But like, let's say your thoughts, you're aware of your thoughts. But since you notice that you're perceiving your thoughts, you stop paying attention to the thoughts and you pay attention to the act of perceiving itself. And this is where the question comes. My guru Muji, he calls this the end of the road question. It has 2 parts. He says, can the perceiver be perceived? And the implicit second part is, if so, who perceives the perceiver? And so the attention is turned from the thoughts to the act of perceiving, to the one who is perceiving. And so it's gone from object to subject. And what happens when you do this is that the mind actually runs itself, it like blows a fuse. It runs into a feedback loop, wherein the perceiver perceives the perception of the perceiver, perceiving the perception of the perceiver, perceiving the perception of the perceiver, perceiving the perception of the perceiver. And all of that is occurring. But again, you are seeing all of it. All of it is occurring on the screen of consciousness. And so even that is seen. And so the question comes again, who am I? And if you ask it genuinely enough, some response will come from the inner depths of your being, which echoes back, who asks the question? And at that moment, you like explode because something's been exposed. Because the thought of the thinking apparatus being the self, or just any idea of a separate individual being the self, is false. That is not you. That's your idea of yourself. That's a thought in your own mind, but you are not your mind. You're the perceiver of your mind. And so consciousness is aware of the mind, but then when consciousness becomes conscious of consciousness, that's what I call true consciousness. It's going from phenomenal existence back into its source. And the source of consciousness is awareness. Awareness is the ultimate reality. It is unborn and undying. And this is the conclusion of my own thought system. Essentially, there is an absolute relativity within phenomenal existence. But the absolute relativity exists within a context of ultimate reality. And now the ultimate reality, the way I say it, is that God alone exists. You could say that the self alone exists, or if both of those terms bother you for one reason or another, you could say the truth alone exists. But whatever it is, that alone exists, because that has no beginning, it has no end, it has no boundary, it has no limitation, it has no conception, it's inconceivable, it was never conceived, there's nothing outside of it, because there's no boundary between inside and outside. That's it. And so that alone exists. And so since that alone exists, everything else that exists in relation to that, because everything else was born and therefore it will die. It has some boundary within which it is and without which it is not. And so whatever has a boundary occurs within the boundarylessness. And so if we say that this is the ultimate oneness, and the archetype of the one is the monad, then infinity and duality and multiplicity and infinity ultimately exists in relation to this one. But then you have a duality between the monad and infinity. And this seems contradictory, and this is the relativity, the duality that we were talking about. Is it one or is it infinity? Is it singular or is it multiplistic? Who knows? But it exists within a context. There is an implicit zero that's behind the one. If you keep going back, you'll just reach negative numbers. It's not behind, it's just there. And all of the infinite sets of numbers are encompassed by this zero. And so that zero gives birth to the one, but those one are two. And that two exists in relation to infinity. And so those are three. And the three are one, and the one is two, and the two are three. And that's in a forced metaphor way of saying it, but I don't really know how to explain it better than that until what I'm about to tell you. But the main importance behind this is that it's a Trinitarian structure. So there's relative reality, which includes a duality, and then an ultimate reality, which is completely unified. And the duality exists within the context of the one. And so no matter what happens within the realm of duality, the ultimate reality is unaffected. And ultimately everything arises, subsists, and subsides in the ultimate. And because there's only the ultimate reality. That's the nature of the ultimate truth. But the Trinitarian structure is you find it obviously in Christianity. You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In Hinduism, you have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Even within quantum chromodynamics, you have the three, I believe it's quarks within every proton or something like that. Forgive me that this is not my field of expertise yet. But it's either that or like bosons within a quark, I don't know. But it's like there are definitely three. And if one cannot be missing at any time, because if one is missing, then another one comes and replace it because they're interdependent pairs. It's really cool. But the system that I came up, the more elaborate system that I came up with to describe this, is if you define the ultimate reality as awareness. I have this chart. So awareness alone exists. Completely unbegotten, uncontrived, that's it. Awareness alone exists. When awareness becomes aware of awareness, and also, I'm sorry, this is all backwards. When awareness becomes aware of awareness, this is called consciousness. Consciousness is when one thing is aware of itself. So when consciousness first manifests, it is conscious only of consciousness. But since it exists in relation to awareness, when consciousness becomes conscious of awareness as something separate from itself, and now, note, the relation between the two of them is as a wave to an ocean. Both of them are water. And from the ocean's perspective, the wave is not separate from the ocean. But in a Luciferian idea, the wave can think itself separate from the ocean. It can think that it's a separate individual, and it, like, basically, I exist as opposed to God. I don't know about the existence of God. And then this is a J. Krishnamurti idea of, like, God is just an idea that occurs in my mind, but ultimately I don't know about the existence of God or the physics underlying the universe and the mechanisms behind mathematics. I don't know any of that. All I know is myself. I am my own primary datum. So this is the isolated, the separate individual's perspective. And so because of that, it doesn't know the ultimate truth that God alone exists. Therefore, it is a participant in the existence of God. We'll get to that in a second. But this is the ignorance which creates the mental formation which I'm describing. So when consciousness becomes conscious of awareness as something separate from itself, even though it's not separate, but it thinks itself to be separate, this is called mindfulness. Mindfulness is subject-object awareness. One thing is aware of another thing. And so mindfulness is the birth of mind, and the entirety of mind is contained within the single thought, I. When I participates in the quality of being, it becomes I am. And this seems like very intuitive. Of course, I am. But it's also redundant, because you're essentially saying that that which is within the isness itself. Like, why? Number one, you don't have to say anything. There's no reason to say anything. And if you do say, like, acknowledge its existence, there's no reason to say that which is, like, to separate between that which is and the isness itself. They are one. But to distinguish between the two, to say that which is and that which is participating in the isness, creates like a subtle distinction. And from there, you have two choices. You can either say, I am that being the awareness from whence I first arose. And so you have this thought loop, I am that, the source. So I am that, 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 I am. And through doing that, the wave merges back into the totality of the ocean. It arises, it subsists, and then it subsides back in. And then, but it can also say, I am this. I am this, aka the thought, the body into which the thought I am is being born. So literally the body of the thought, I am this thought. I am this thought. I am this mind. And then ultimately it's solidified in the phrase, I am this body. I am this body is the definition of avidya, which means ignorance in Sanskrit. And that is the proper birth of the ego, or the separate individual, the idea of a separate individual. That's my own little system. It's not like doctrine, truth. You don't have to subscribe to that. That's just how I describe it. A bonus feature of that is that it's like a Platonic emanation or idea. It's some sort of emanation idea, but it's specifically inherent within that it says that awareness and consciousness is the nature of the universe. So you don't have like dead matter. All of it is just forms of consciousness which have condensed into mind, which have further condensed into matter, which are all like different spectrums within the same phenomenon. Again, not doctrine truth, but like that's my 2 cents. That's how I think the universe works according from my perspective at this exact moment. So anyway, you have that, what I just described. That is essentially a long drawn out version of explaining what I call the fractal mind of God. And so the ultimate truth that God alone exists. If God wants to create, the only way he can create is through the act of contemplation. Because within contemplation, there's an inherent trinity. There is a subject of contemplation, an act of contemplation, and an object of contemplation. And the object cannot exist independent of the subject because the object is merely the reflection of the subject. But the subject can exist independent from the object, just as you can shatter a mirror and the reflection will disappear, but you will remain. So God contemplates God, contemplating God. And then this feedback loops into itself to where God contemplating God, 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 contemplating God. I am that 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 I am. God contemplating God, contemplating God, contemplating God, contemplating I am that I am that I am that I am that I am. And so one's like a descending motion creating the universe, and one is an ascending motion returning to the source. And then you have the neutral version of it, which is that the perceiver perceives the perception of the perceiver perceives the perception of the perceiver perceives the perception. And so these sort of feedback loops, what they do, they're like little motors, or they're like fractal generators, or they're like I don't know exactly how to describe them, but they're like they're mantras. Gate gate para sangate bodhisattva. Gate gate para sangate bodhisattva. Gate gate para sangate bodhisattva. They're underlying the mind. They're like the prerequisite for thought. And so once you have that motion going, then it can essentially evolve. So you have God, which is the subject of contemplation, but you also have God, which is the object of contemplation, which is the subject of his own contemplation, which is the object of another. And so it's this continual unfolding. And through that process of creation, you create the mind, essentially. And my conception of God's mind is as a fractal. And now you have 2 types of fractals primarily. There are self-similar shapes, which are just shapes which repeat themselves in and over and over and over and over again. It's the same thought. But then you have fractals like the Mandelbrot set, which is like the grandfather of all fractals, which is like fractals fractalizing each other, and fractals upon fractals upon fractals, and just... and they're all distinct. It's not the same fractal. There are thousands and millions of different individual distinct fractals appearing within this one fractal. And if you don't know what a fractal is, look it up. It's amazing. But it goes into itself again and again and again and again in all of these intricate ways. And that's my idea of what God's mind is like. And so in that sense, we are all thoughts in the mind of God. And we are also God experiencing himself as a thought, that thought being I am. And that's what we just described. I am this body. And so God is experiencing himself as a thought within his own mind. Just like you think that you're your own mind you think that you are your thoughts until you realize I'm the thinker of my thoughts. So I'm not the thinker of my thoughts, I'm the perceiver of my thoughts. I'm not the perceiver of my thoughts, I'm the perceiver of the perceiver. Ultimate revelation. This is my own personal Kabbalah. I love Kabbalah so much. But anyway, so this is the fractal of mind. And basically the benefit of this view is, for example, you can study reincarnation, but you can study Hindu reincarnation. You can study Buddhist reincarnation, whether it be Theravada or via the Abhidhamma. You can study Jewish reincarnation. You can study Hermetic reincarnation. There's many different systems of reincarnation. And each of them are beautifully distinct. Each of them are very complex. It would take like an entire lifetime to fully master any one of them. Each of them have amazing, complex cosmologies interconnected and woven with them. There's entire ideological systems connected to these thoughts of systems of reincarnation. But the problem is none of them agree with one another. And so if we have a problem like that in physics, we wonder, well, which one of these is real? And that's, for me, that's a question wrongly put. One moment, please. Because ultimately, there is only the ultimate reality. There's only the ultimate truth. Everything other than that is not unreal, but it is relatively real. It's entered the realm of duality, and so everything depends on relativity. And so it is relatively real. If we define God or truth or the ultimate reality as being in the most Platonic sense, then we can say that all things are real insofar as they participate in the quality of being, but they are unreal insofar as they fail to encompass the totality of being, or they fall short of the totality of being. Because no phenomenally existent thing, nothing with a boundary, nothing which can be conceived, no thing whatsoever can encompass the totality of being. And so since that is so, it's only relatively real. It's real insofar as it participates in the quality of being, but it's unreal insofar as it falls short of being. And what that does is it allows for different ideological systems and conceptual frameworks to exist simultaneously. One does not contradict the other, just as two trees do not contradict one another in a forest. Walk into the Amazon. How many beautiful expressions of life, of flora and fauna, will you find within the first 10 seconds? How many bugs, how many animals, how many plants, all of it is just this beautiful unfolding of life. So too with truths. You cannot hold one truth in relation to it. Well, you cannot judge one truth by another truth, because all of them are only relatively real. And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, whether we're talking about Einsteinian mechanics or Newtonian mechanics or whitheadian philosophy or Platonic philosophy or Pokemon or Naruto or Marvel, whatever it is, it exists insofar as we can talk about it as a phenomena. Like, you can't say that Dialga is the Pokemon of space and Palkia is the Pokemon of time. That's incorrect. Dialga is time and Palkia is space. But both of them are Pokemon. They're made up. Okay, so is the rest of reality. That's the implications of this system. Because my Guru Muji has a saying, there is one earth, but there are billions of worlds. And what that points to is the fact that all of us interpret reality and experience reality differently and uniquely. And so although we seem to be on the same plane of existence, my body can communicate with your body, we're actually living in completely different conceptual frameworks. And essentially what this system does is it honors that, because it says that you are a thought in the mind of God, and so you exist within a certain context. But like a Hindu and a Jewish sage and a scientist and a Christian or Buddhist monk sitting in one room, although they live on the same earth, they are not living in the same worlds. And so likewise, all of us, I really do have some feeling as though we are all within like systems within systems within systems within systems. And so one person can live in a world governed by Einsteinian relativity, and then another person can live in a world governed by Newtonian mechanics, and then another person can live in a world governed by the sovereign powers of the gods in the heavens, and then another person can live in the world wherein there are 14 lokas, and another person can live in a world where it's the the Saha world, of the 6 worlds within samsara, and another person within the 500 worlds of samsara, and then another person within... there's all of these different systems, and none of them are ultimately true, because there's only one ultimate truth. None of them are ultimately real, but they are all relatively real. And that thus ends my TED Talk, my explanation of how I perceive reality. That's my thought system. Essentially, there is an absolute relativity, meaning that everything is only relatively real, but it exists within the context of an ultimate reality. And that ultimate reality means that everything is relatively real, because everything is only an expression of that, no matter how complex and how nuanced. All of the forms may contradict one another, but they in and of themselves are pure expressions of the ultimate reality. And ultimately we are only that, and there is only that. And so that manifests, it subsists, and it subsides back into itself. And all of these beautifully complex forms are like the dance of time. And you can have infinitely many different worlds and universes and cosmologies and ideologies, but all of them can exist simultaneously. Even if they contradict one another, they can still exist within some common context, because they are only relatively real, meaning that they are meaningless, but they are relatively real, meaning that they are free to express themselves. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. I really hope that this helped somebody in some way, shape, or form, or at very least that you can have an expanded perspective of life, or honestly that you enjoyed this as entertainment, because that's all this really is. It's just someone talking out of their ass. So, namaste, shalom.